Hello, welcome to this session of the National Book Festival, brought to you by the Library of Congress, which is celebrating its 20th year this year. I'm Steve Pearlstein. I'm a longtime business and economics columnist at the Washington Post, also a professor at George Mason University, and the author of a book about American capitalism called Moral Capitalism. My guests today are Rick Perlstein, who's from the branch of the Pearlstein clan that's very strong on reporting, a little weak on spelling. He spells his name differently. A Milwaukee native, spent some time at a publication called Lingua Franca. He's a man of the left who has written 3 books chronicling the rise of men on the right: Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, and his latest book, Reagan Land, America's Right Turn. Also joined today by Nick Lemann, a longtime New Yorker writer, former dean of the Columbia Journalism School, who, like many of his generation in journalism, got his start at the feet of the great editor Charlie Peters at Washington Monthly. He's written books about the SAT and Black migration from the South, and his new book is Transaction Man: The Rise and Decline of the American Dream. Welcome to you both. Nick, you seem to be somewhere rural. Where are you coming to us from?
Yes, I am. I'm somewhere very rural. I'm in a little village that nobody's ever heard of called Haines Falls, New York, which is in upstate New York in the very northeast corner of the Catskill Mountains. And that's where I have been for the last 4.5, going on 5 months because of the coronavirus.
Well, it sounds idyllic, but after 4 or 5 months, who knows? So Transaction Man, tell us what it's ostensibly about and then what it's really about.
Okay. I guess, I don't know if this is ostensibly or really, but it's the premise of the book is that there are a number of ways to organize a capitalist system. And the American capitalist system has been organized in a succession of fairly different ways over the last 100 years. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to propose a sort of history of the different big ideas by which American capitalism has been organized. I do this through a series of profiles and of institutions, people, and places, and try to show you how different these versions are from each other, and how each has its good and bad sides. I'm arguing that there's 3 big phases in the American organization of the American economy over the last 100 years. I'm calling them institution-oriented, transaction-oriented, and network-oriented. Network-oriented is the one we may be in now, the era of the big tech companies dominating the economy. I should say one other thing. There's a famous old book called The Organization Man, published in 1957. By William White, a journalist at Fortune magazine. And my title is a sort of homage to his book, and also trying to note how completely vanished the world that he was writing about, the world of big corporations that were going to live forever, dominating American life, American employment, and the political economy, how that world went away. Essentially, the story I'm trying to tell is what happened, when White wrote the book and many other people writing in his era. This was a forever economic regime, and now it's gone. So that's kind of the story I'm telling.
How did you get the idea to write the book? Or why did you write the book? What prompted you to go in that direction?
It's a little bit of everything that's ever happened in my life. I am no longer quite so young as I used to be, and I witnessed the trend. I'm old enough to have been the last group in the Organization Man era, or at least that's what my generation thought we were entering when we entered the workplace. My closest brush with that was working at the Washington Post, where you've worked for so many years, Steve. And as you know, at least then, it was assumed that the minute you got in the door, you were going to be there until retirement, as long as you didn't screw up too badly. And the company would take care of you, and you would do whatever the company said. There and in many other ways, I witnessed all of the certainties that I grew up with go away about how, an ordinary person would interact with the large structures of the economy. And it made me curious to find out, what happened. And just as a tiny example, I work at Columbia University. So if you go back to the 1950s and even into the 1960s, and see who were the trustees at Columbia University, which is a sort of marker for who's in the establishment, it would be primarily people who had started in a big corporation and rose up the ranks over the decades and then become the head of the corporation. Now, if you look, there's nobody like that in the Columbia trustees. And there's many examples. This is just like where I live institutionally. And it's essentially all people who do private equity, a field that didn't exist when I was young. So, I mean, I asked myself the question, how did this happen? Who thought of it? Why did it happen? What have been the effects of it?
So, Nick, the first period is this organization man organizing principle, the institutional era. The last is the network era. The middle era, how did you describe that one?
I would describe that as essentially the rise of Wall Street and to use a more academic word, financialization as the governing principle of the economy. The financial firm I use as a principal example is Morgan Stanley. And, as late as 1970, Morgan Stanley had something like 200 employees, and it was a private partnership, and people like us on the screen, who were kind of pundits writing about the state of the American economy, often would say things like, Wall Street is vestigial and soon will not even exist because corporations are so powerful. And now, Morgan Stanley has been through lots of ups and downs, including the financial crisis, but it has north of 50,000 employees. It's one of the systemically important financial institutions, aka too big to fail, meaning it's sort of regulated by and guaranteed by the federal government. And the power has really shifted from corporations that were thought to be able to do whatever they wanted to Wall Street firms and a financial system that dictates terms to corporations under the name of honoring shareholder value.
And then in the third phase, the network phase, the power perhaps has gone to the network, meaning the web, essentially. And
kind of the big five companies. But the common thread in all of these, or a common thread in phase one of the heyday of these big industrial corporations that were supposed to live forever, the U.S. chose a Western European style social democracy or social welfare state, and instead had, as a sort of partial solution, a corporate-based welfare state. So we had Social Security in those years. We didn't have Medicare, and you would assume that if you could get on at a big corporation, they would provide, the basics of healthcare, job security, and a generous retirement pension, rather than the government. So as these second and third phases came on, that part of it, that social compact, got stripped out and created a world of much more economic insecurity for middle-class Americans and working class.
So in a sense, in that early period, that so-called golden period, the greatest socialistic institutions in the United States were large blue chip corporations that redistributed income and provided income security, um, and took care of people. And that was just assumed to be true. It wasn't anything written in law. It was just a norm of behavior that everyone expected.
Right. It was written in the law of punditocracy, and so it's often stated by people. And you know, there are many things about this age that weren't so golden. We can get into that if you want to. But just as an example, you know, Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant and king of the business pundits for decades because he loved these sweeping statements. He wrote a book in the late 70s after this world was already falling apart, but he didn't notice yet, saying, guess what? America is now a socialist country. And the reason is that big corporations have these large pension funds, and their unions that were heavily unionized then also have large pension funds. And these funds are the biggest actors in the stock market. So, you know, Karl Marx, if he were alive, would be happy because the workers own the means of production. So that was kind of a purple prose version of what you just said, stated by Peter Drucker.
So, Rick, where are you coming to us from?
I live in Chicago, on the north side of Chicago, in a neighborhood called West Edgewater.
How far is that? Nick, you wrote about a neighborhood on the south side called Chicago Lawn. So this is the opposite part of Chicago.
10 miles as the crow flies. I'm about 6,000 north. He's about 6,000 south. Every Chicagoan knows 800 addresses to a mile, so you can do the math.
Okay. Reaganland is a detailed history of the failure of the Jimmy Carter presidency and the victory of Ronald Reagan in 1980. That's ostensibly what it's about. It's quite an extensive volume. For those of you who could maybe see it, almost 900 pages. So there's a lot there, very rich in detail. Well, what is it really about? What are the underlying themes?
Well, the important thing to understand is it's the fourth and final book of a series that I've been working on since 1997. And it actually dovetails nicely with what Nick was saying, because it starts in this moment of American capitalism and American society in which all the poobahs of opinion and all the gatekeepers believed that we'd figured it out, that we'd kind of come up with this nice equilibrium that kind of took care of people, created wealth, created stability in the world. And it was generally understood to be kind of a center-left liberalism, that kind of the world was kind of converging, where we were going to become more like Western Europe. The ordeal of race was kind of fading away as the South kind of joined the modern world. And that anyone who disagreed with this, whether on the left or on the right, was kind of nuts, right? So that was my first book, called Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus. And it covered the years from 58 to 1964, in which the Republicans nominated someone who despised that consensus, Barry Goldwater, who represented these capitalists who thought this whole blue chip system of kind of guaranteed employment and kind of an entente cordiale between labor and business and government was vile, socialistic. And of course, Barry Goldwater lost in one of the biggest landslides to that point. And the book ends with the pundits saying conservatism is a complete dead letter in the American experience, and that if the Republicans don't completely purge this conservative influence, that there might not be a Republican Party. Something, by the way, that comes back again and again and again. I write about that happening after Jimmy Carter's success too. And then the next book, Nixonland, is centered on the figure of Nixon and how he kind of weaponized the resentment of middle-class people towards all the social changes that were happening in the world. So, you know, Francis Ford Coppola said, you know, if you have a really good story, you should be able to summarize it in one word, right? And then The Godfather, he said, is succession, right? So basically, Before the Storm was a book about organization, how this movement on the right organized to become a political force. Nixonland is about resentment. the kind of resentment we see from, say, a Sarah Palin on the right, that the liberal swells are all looking down their noses at us and they're a bunch of snobs and they don't understand anything. The next book, Invisible Bridge, covers the rise of Reagan during the years of Watergate. And I would say the one word would be innocence. The basic storyline is that after Vietnam and after Watergate and after the ordeal of the Arab oil shock and stagflation and America realizing for the first time that it wasn't economically going to stand astride the world like a colossus, there was an enormous ennui in American life, but also a very salutary kind of citizenship in which people were really looking hard at whether the idea of America as the world's indispensable nation, which got us into Vietnam, whether the idea of capitalism being this engine for continual growth, all these things were being kind of looked at in a very challenging way, all over the place. In the organs, not only of kind of the left, but also in the center. And Ronald Reagan kind of comes along and says, "No, America is God's chosen nation. It will always be God's chosen nation. Follow me, and I'll absolve you of this necessity of thinking dark thoughts about America." Right? He runs for president in 1976. For the Republican nomination against a sitting president in his own party, Gerald Ford, and loses. So that's that book. This book culminates with Ronald Reagan winning the presidency, and at least in one of its aspects, the economic and corporate aspect, the world that Nick discusses in the first section of Transaction Man really being on the way out. In coalition with all sorts of other elements, right? So I write about Jerry Falwell, turning the pews of America into kind of precincts. I write about the corporate world savagely organizing against that entente cordiale I talked about, in which basically they accepted the imperative of regulation and harmony with labor. You wrote about this too, Steve. And then finally, there's this figure of Ronald Reagan, right, who has this striking charisma and this ability to kind of radiate confidence, warmth, optimism in a world in which President Jimmy Carter has kind of organized his own presidency around the idea that we have to do more with less, that we have to acknowledge the imperative of austerity, that government has gotten out of control, basically, saw the world as kind of a austere clapboard, hardwood Baptist pew, of his childhood, in kind of 1930s Georgia. So this series of books endeavors to explain how America transformed itself over these 30 years that it covers, from a center-left nation to a center-right nation. By the time not only Ronald Reagan wins the presidency, but some very, very conservative senators give the Republican Party the Senate. After, once again, in 1977, the pundits saying that if the Republicans don't purge the conservatives, the Republican Party is going to go out of business.
When I read the book, Rick, it reminded me of Richard Ben Kramer's great book from the 1988 campaign, "What It Takes." Did you have that in mind at all when you wrote it and when you wrote Reaganland?
No, I've never read it, actually.
You've never read it?
I don't read a lot of narrative nonfiction. I read kind of scholarship and classic, novels and short stories. Yeah. So I don't read a lot of my genre, actually.
Okay. Let me ask you about Reagan, and then I'll have some general questions for you. Ronald Reagan, was he a genius who captured the mood of the moment that you just described? Was he just a fraud, manipulator, or was he just a front man for these other groups? I mean, well, how would you have us think about Ronald Reagan?
Well, if he's a knucklehead, he's a pretty skilled one, because of course he beat all the people who were calling him a knucklehead for 30, 40 years, right? I mean,
Right.
part of the gift of Ronald Reagan is that he was so consistently underestimated by his ideological enemies. I tell a story in the book that I got straight from the horse's mouth from Hendrik Hertzberg, who was a Carter speechwriter. And he said, our strategy was, we knew that as soon as we got Ronald Reagan on a debate stage standing next to Jimmy Carter, people would understand that Reagan was not intelligent, that he was not responsible, that he was old, he was decrepit, he was crazy, right? And of course, they were able to schedule one debate. They set up the rules so Carter would have as much time as possible to rebut Ronald Reagan's errors, mistakes, lies, if you prefer. And they went into that debate 5 days before the election tied. And Ronald Reagan won in a landslide, long story short. I actually found a memo from Jimmy Carter's advertising coordinator, basically arguing that the entire strategy of the campaign was to demonstrate that Jimmy Carter was smarter than Ronald Reagan, right? Well, that turned out to be not a very good very good strategy. I would say basically how I would evaluate that question is that there are lots of kinds of intelligence, right? He probably couldn't have done calculus, but he had an incredible gift for reading a crowd and reading the mood of a constituency and the public. And he had some very firmly held beliefs that were based on his own reading and study. He was not very fluid and supple in changing those beliefs. And yet at the same time, he was also, and this can be rendered in an insulting way or a generous way. The insulting way is, yes, he was very good at taking direction, just like he learned when he was, a Hollywood contract player. The other is that he had the discipline and maturity to grasp that there were some things, some people who knew better than him on some subjects, and that he should defer to them. And I have all kinds of stuff in the book comparing, for example, the letters that his staff prepared for him to sign to New York Times columnists and scholars that made him sound like a distinguished mainstream intellectual. And then there were the letters he dictated to his friends, in which he pondered the consequences of prophecy in the book of Revelation for what's going on in the Middle East, or sent letters to Gene Dixon, the newspaper psychic. So I don't really kind of come down in any kind of dogmatic way on it, but it's like a lot, like historians like to say, it's a complicated question.
So here's a question for both of you. You essentially write about the sort of move from this era of consensus, sort of center-left consensus, with big corporations being at the center of a system that created prosperity, widely distributed prosperity, and this fell apart in the late 1970s. And my question, you both seem to suggest that this was a moment at which the country took a wrong turn. And yet you also both lay out in great detail why it wasn't working in 1978, why it had not worked for the previous decade in terms economically, politically, in terms of our faith in institutions. So explain to me this tension between the old system was beginning to come apart. The United States economy was becoming uncompetitive. Our political system was unwinding. And yet, so we decided to take a turn. We needed to do something different, and we did do something different. But your argument is that we did the wrong thing. Is it not?
So let me start by saying I write as a penitent to some extent. I was a young liberal journalist in Washington at the time that we're talking about, and I regarded these changes with tremendous enthusiasm. As a young writer for the Washington Monthly, I argued for the world that I'm now saying was a wrong turn, as you say. So I've had a lot of time to reflect on what we got wrong in those days. And I'm not talking about conservatives. I'm talking about sort of centrist liberals like myself.
We're now called, and I'm one of them too, by the way, Nick. We're called neoliberals now, which is
right.
which is not a nice thing to say to someone anymore. But anyway.
Right. And that was a word relentlessly promoted by the aforementioned Charlie Peters of the Washington Monthly, thinking everyone would embrace it. And you know, it and then now it's turned into a negative. It was unimaginable. Two or three things quickly, and then Rick will want to come in. One is we all believed exactly what Rick said, that conservatism has died and that it was inconceivable that Reagan would ever be president. So what we thought was the problem was, I'm using the terminology of my book, that sort of institutions and interest groups were a bad thing in politics. And that if you had a politics that was oriented toward, quote, doing the right thing as determined by sort of technocratic elites, then you would have all the major problems that you alluded to, Steve, solved, and an enduring social and political order. And I think that assumption, which is sort of a structural assumption in a way, was 100% wrong. That is what I'm a penitent about. So we were always saying, well, you know, if you could get rid of unions, then, you know, you could have really a good life for workers. And if you could get rid of regulations, then you could, you know, really reform business. And, you know, it was all that kind of thinking. We were very happy with this shift from corporate economy to a market economy. And we just didn't see a lot of things coming, including one, the rise of conservatism, and two, a kind of the dramatic rise in inequality, which is global and is related to all these things. And that if you sort of destructure the political economy, that would be a consequence. It seems obvious at the time, but it was not to penitents like myself.
So, Rick, what would you say to that? I'm not sure anyone ever called you a neoliberal, Rick. So, what would you say about the wrong turn?
Sure, I would answer the question in a political way. One of the things that one of the reasons everything went south in the 1970s is that people didn't grasp that the whole system was built on the cheapness and plentifulness of this one resource, petroleum, that turned out to be controlled by actual human beings, right, who had actual interests of their own in the Middle East, and they decided to basically throw their weight around. And you know, at the cusp of the Arab oil boycott in 1973, people were talking about things like energy being too cheap to meter, right? And once you have something that is not a factor of production that anyone considered particularly important, and suddenly it's the tail that wags the whole global economy's dog, right? We can see that in retrospect, right? You know, why did inflation happen? Why did so much convulsion happen in the global economy? I think a lot of it was this one-time thing, right? In which a part of the world that had basically that, you know, Iran was like a colony of the United States. Saudi Arabia was like a colony of the United States. All these nations decided that they were going to, you know, basically speak up for themselves. And one of the things that happened when these convulsions were happening and all this inflation was happening was that people took advantage of this, right? Political actors acted with will and intelligence in order to say, look at these terrible things that are happening. Here's why they are happening. Here's why they will continue to happen. And here's what we need to do to stop them happening. And those were people basically on the corporate right. And one of the things that they were able to say was inflation is caused by too much government, by too much spending, by budget deficits. And Jimmy Carter very much with his austerity ideology bought into that too. Now we know in retrospect that was one of the most insanely wrong things that smart people have ever believed, that we now have 2% inflation and massive government deficits. So these people, by making a very compelling and strong political argument that people, all sorts of people at the Washington Monthly and people at the National Review and people in the White House, both the Carter and Ford White House, were able to buy, were able to say, we need to cut government. We need to cut the social safety net. We need to right the ship. We need to have tight money. We love Paul Volcker, right? That was caused untold misery. That was completely unnecessary because of a bad idea that political actors who had interests advanced very effectively. They didn't only advance it very effectively by making economic arguments, and often very propagandistic and false economic arguments, as I show in the book. Lots of dishonesty in that world. But they did so by joining in coalition with a Christian right that, while it was quite economically conservative too, didn't necessarily have the same interests. So what I'm talking about is the pulling together of a political coalition. And I think that how that could have gone a different way is that political coalition being rooted out and defeated, right? Hindsight is 2020, but that was probably a time in which we needed more social democracy and not less, more security for ordinary Americans. And that would have required a redistribution of power in the society. And unfortunately, the one guy who was making that argument, Ted Kennedy, was a pretty poor messenger. That's a pretty fun story to tell in the book too. We're kind of left with. By the way, one of the biggest surprises in the book in the 1980 election, we think of 1980 as this great mandate for Reagan, and he emerges as a shining hero, was the enormous apathy. One of my favorite documents that I found was a political cartoon of a guy on election day, and it's his feet dangling from behind the curtain because you saw the three choices: John Anderson, who was also very big, he wanted a 50% gas tax, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan, and he hung himself. So
Rick, do you think then that the world would have been better off if the major industrial unions had become stronger rather than weaker, that we had closed off the American economy to trade, which is what they wanted, that we had kept regulation of the airlines, that we had kept regulations of natural gas? You think that the United States would have been stronger in the long run if we'd done all those things?
Well, the unions not only became weaker, they also abandoned organizing, right? I mean, George Meany cut the organizing department, right? So, I think workers having more power probably would have done a better job of, if unions could have gone to the negotiating table with government and business and said, look, we want you, in a corporatist way, negotiate a contract between the three of us that is good for everybody. As far as airline deregulation, one of the consequences of that is lots of small towns in America don't have airline service anymore. These are the kind of places where the deplorables live, where life is terrible and people are.
But four times as many Americans travel on airplanes today as they used to. When Nick and I went to college, when Rick and I went to college, nobody went home for Thanksgiving because it was too expensive. Now everyone goes home for Thanksgiving. You want to go back to those days?
Table with kind of strong negotiating positions, maybe we could have achieved a deregulation that was done equitably, right? That was done democratically. I mean, you got to remember, America's still a country where the only country in the industrial world where you can be fired by your boss, because he doesn't like the color of your tie, right? There's all these ways in which the political economy is, radically undemocratic. So, yes, we could probably have become business friendly with more mobility and more entrepreneurship. Like Finland has more entrepreneurship because you can start a business because you don't have to worry about losing your health insurance.
Well, I guess here's my question for you. Is it possible that, in fact, we were right, Nick, you and I were right in 1980, that there did need to be, the pendulum did need to be moved back in a different direction, that we did do that the United States economy did recover its edge and its entrepreneurial vigor in the late 1980s, and that things were actually pretty good in the early 1990s, but then the pendulum went too far in the wrong direction, so that it was a necessary corrective. It just was taken too far. Is that possible, Nick and Rick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would like to frame it in a somewhat different way, but let's go forward to the 21st century. If we all agree that the pendulum swung in one direction, then it kept swinging too far. And I think we can all agree that now in the US and elsewhere, we're in a sort of global rebellion against this order whose creation we're talking about. So that's a major political fact. As many have noted, Joe Biden is running as the farthest to the left Democratic presidential nominee, which for those who've been following him for a long time is massively counterintuitive and surprising. But the most to the left on these economic issues in many decades. So there's the voters are pushing the elites to be more attentive to their interests. I think what I didn't see at the time was that pulling all these restraints off the economy was going to engineer a large amount of inequality that has been the obsessive fact of the politics of U.S. and Europe for a good 10 years now, if not more. And it's a little bit like Lucy and the football in the old Peanuts cartoon. It's sort of, we neoliberals were saying, if or not so much we, but the people we were allied with were saying to us, we promise if you take all these restraints away, we will retain a fiery commitment to a just society. But then, it felt like the football got pulled away and that didn't happen. And so back in the late 70s, I had too much faith in a society that was made very fluid and without the kind of safety nets and restraints that I now think are required to create a good society that works for everybody, not just the people it works for.
Rick, you I assume would reject the idea that that it was a necessary but excessive corrective.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty vague question. What's the corrective?
The corrective was a move toward a little less regulation, a little more insecurity and inequality in the service of growing the pie and making sure that the American economy didn't become uncompetitive as compared to Japan or Germany and other places.
Well, I mean, the results are before us. We don't have a particularly competitive economy. We have a fascist in the White House. We have violence in the streets, and we have basically less stability and integrity in our society than any time since, the 1930s. So I can't say that things went in just the right way.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure about uncompetitive, but let me ask a final question. Nick, you said one of the things that we thought several times was that conservatism was going to be dead. And it turns out, gee, it wasn't. Now, people election today, they're looking at Trump and they say, finally, this is that conservatism that has reached the end of its rope. And now it will be dead and buried after this election. A lot of people are saying that. You're shaking your head. What do you want to tell us?
I want to tell you, really, really be careful if you live in a kind of liberal bubble. I don't know about you guys, but I do in my daily life. Really be careful about assuming that if you are a liberal, that conservatism is now dead and the whole country is liberal. That, this is a big, complicated, ever-changing country. Rick captures that very well in his book with lots of elements, lots of surprises. As Rick points out, we were not sitting around in Washington saying in 1977, the greatest threat to the whole order we're interested in is Christian academies in the South, which are going to become the platform for, organizing a hugely effective conservative movement. So, they're out there. They're not in plain sight. And please do not be complacent and think about a politics that appeals to ordinary working people, not just to elites and their own notions of what a just society is. Just the last thing, I had a real wake up. I mean, Rick, you've been to Chicagoland, right? And so there was a person who's a character who sort of starts the book, an auto dealer named Nick D'Andrea, who got kind of X'd out in the GM reorganization. So he and his wife were showing me around the neighborhood. They took me to this auto repair shop, in what had become a black neighborhood run by a white guy, just a little auto repair shop, like Sanford and Son or something. And this is summer of 2015. And this guy, I could not get out of the auto repair shop because he was telling me how great Donald Trump was. I live in Morningside Heights, Upper West Side, New York. I don't meet that kind of person. And I spent 2-3 hours with this guy. And, you can argue whether was he right or was he wrong, but it made a huge impression on me that he loved Trump. He felt Trump spoke for him. There was a passion there. And I came home and I said to a lot of my friends and family, don't count this guy out because he's touching something that people feel.
And Rick, you've studied the conservative movement. Do you think that the conservative movement now is in deep trouble with this coming election, and that liberal ascendancy is we're on the cusp of that, or you're not feeling that?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest danger in talking about the upcoming election is only talking about it in terms of elections. I mean, the crisis we're looking at now is it's not just the way we've looked at elections in all of our lifetimes of how many votes a candidate gets in what state. It's a question of whether, 40% of the country is going to consider the election legitimate, right? I mean, the parallels we need to think of is what, Chile looked like in 1970 or, Berlin in 1932, not just, what are the balances of forces between, Democrats and Republicans and which electoral coalitions they're going to be going for. Conservatism doesn't go away because conservatism is part of the human state. It's part of the way Americans think and feel and identify themselves in the world. But the question now is, whether the institutions of American democracy and small r republicanism can survive one of our political parties, surrendering itself to authoritarianism. I mean, really, that's the question.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you both, Rick Perlstein and Nick Lemann, for joining us on this session of the National Book Festival brought to you by the Library of Congress. It was a good conversation, and thanks to all of you who are watching for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Cheers.